Welcome to The Explainer. If you absolutely love diving deep into how everyday grassroots actions collide with massive historic institutions, you are in the exact right place today. We're going to unpack some truly fascinating research by an academic named Carlo Bianchi. Now, just to set the stage, our goal here is to just neutrally unpack Bianchi's findings. We're definitely not here to endorse or critique any specific viewpoint. We're just objectively exploring a super unique historical moment from the 1970s. It was this wild time where grassroots movements really clashed and honestly sometimes merged with the deep cultural ideals of the church. It's like a giant puzzle showing how society actually shifts. So let's jump right into it. So, can music actually shake up the status quo? That is the absolute core question driving Bianca's work, and it's what we really need to keep in the back of our minds today. We usually think of massive social change coming from, new laws or politicians or formal debates. But how do big sweeping movements like feminism or religion actually shape our everyday sense of identity? Bianca's research looks at that exact intersection. And crucially, it asks if something as deeply personal and culturally resonant as music can totally disrupt the established norm. It's a pretty powerful idea, right? Music as a literal vehicle for deep social change. Now, to really wrap our heads around this theory, we kind of need to ground it in a real-world artifact. Bianchi didn't just sit around reading dry political texts, he actually went looking at record sleeves from Padua and Rome. And there's this one fantastic anecdote that just perfectly hits the nail on the head. Picture this. You're sifting through a dusty thrift store in Bologna, Italy, and you pull out this battered vinyl record. On the surface, it just looks like some forgotten old folk music. But when you actually put the needle down, no way. It turns out to be this fiery, radical 1970s protest album. That incredible element of surprise, where an everyday object hides a radical message, is exactly where Bianchi focuses his lens. It just goes to show history is literally hiding everywhere, waiting to be found. Okay, let's dive into this. What we're looking at here is the core dichotomy Bianchi identifies in his research. On one hand, you have the traditional cultural ideals of the time. This was often summed up as the angel of the house mentality, basically the perspective that viewed marriage as destiny and submission as a primary virtue. But then, in stark contrast, you have the feminist critics. And what's wild is that these vocal critics were actually sometimes labeled by their detractors as witches. They were using music to actively attack not just the church as an institution, but these deeply ingrained cultural norms. They were out there actively demanding transformation. It's just a fascinating night and day contrast. But this clash didn't just happen out of nowhere. Bianchi traces the historical roots of these protests right back to high academic theory, specifically Simone de Beauvoir's monumental foundational text, The Second Sex. What's absolutely incredible to see here is the migration of these ideas. Bianchi shows how these highly complex philosophical concepts didn't just stay locked away in ivory towers or universities. Instead, they filtered down. They bled right into protest lyrics and everyday conversations on the street. These massive ideas became accessible to everyone, literally set to a melody. So, where was this battle actually fought? Well, this feminist critique wasn't just some top-down attack targeting the Pope or the bishops. Not at all. This protest was threaded directly through the absolute fabric of daily life. The music tackled everyday issues happening in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in mass media. We are talking about songs openly discussing marriage, abortion, sexuality, the division of housework, the whole shebang. They were taking these massive institutional critiques and dropping them right into the domestic sphere. Sometimes it was subtle, but a lot of times it was completely head-on. And speaking of head-on, there was a specific, incredibly powerful rallying cry found in the Italian music of the time, Ci siamo stufate, which essentially translates to, we're fed up. Bianchi makes it really clear that these songs weren't just whining or simple complaints. They were serious, highly organized demands. They were demanding real transformation and demanding that society finally acknowledge these deeply repressed feelings and needs. When you hear a lyric like, we're fed up, belted out by a chorus of voices, it's not just a song anymore. It becomes a definitive line drawn in the cultural sand. Now, what's really interesting about this timeline is how we can literally map the church's institutional response over the years. They absolutely felt this cultural pressure. So before the 1960s, those traditional ideals we talked about largely dominated. But then, moving into the mid-century, we get the Vatican II Council. This was a giant reform that led to new roles for Catholic women and actually changed how theologians even thought about gender. And by the time we hit the 1970s, we see the institution actively responding to the cultural wave by spawning entirely new, officially sanctioned female music groups. One of the biggest groups to come out of this era of church reform was called Gen Verde. As Bianchi notes, they were created to present a softer, much more hopeful vision of womanhood. Neutrally speaking, it was basically the institution's way of saying, hey, angels can sing too. But the absolutely crucial distinction here is why they were singing. They were singing for unity, not for rebellion. It was a strategic, institutional countermelody to those fiery protest songs, aiming to carve out a space for female voices that still perfectly aligned with the faith's reformed, yet very structured ideals. But as I really want to stress here, historical analysis rarely gives us perfectly clean lines, does it? Bianchi's research actually uncovers a tremendous amount of ambiguity. The boundaries between the so-called angels and the witches, between the loyal faithful and the fierce rebels, were highly blurred. On one side, you had internal reformers. These were feminists who stayed inside the church, actively pushing for change from within. But opposing that method, you had external radicals. They stood completely outside the institution, fundamentally questioning whether reforming a structure that massive was even possible in the first place. The lines of allegiance were just incredibly complex. And it's exactly that complexity that turns music itself into a historical battleground. It forces us to ask a really deep philosophical question. Could a woman's voice only sing for God, in perfect harmony and unity? Or could it shout in the streets, demanding massive social transformation? Well, according to Bianchi's deep dive into the 1970s archives, there really is no simple answer. Music just became the exact space where these two massive possibilities collided, wrestled, and actually occasionally overlapped. And this right here brilliantly illustrates why this historical research actually matters to us today, no matter where you live or what your background is. Bianchi's paper is honestly a masterclass case study in how big social forces infiltrate the absolute tiniest details of our daily lives. I mean, it happens in our playlists, at Sunday dinners, at weddings, and just everyday talk when we challenge what's considered natural. If you've ever felt that rush of energy listening to a modern protest song, or if you've ever found yourself debating family roles with relatives over a holiday dinner, well, you're actually living a piece of this exact history right now. The venue might change, but that dynamic, it totally remains. So, this brings us to a deeply provocative thought to leave you with. This explainer, much like Bianchi's academic research, isn't meant to be the final absolute truth. It's a framework, a way to help you reflect and debate. Don't just take this history as gospel. I really encourage you to keep digging into this stuff. Listen to some old protest songs, look into historical movements, and most importantly, ask yourself, where does tradition end and where does change actually begin? Remember, there's always more to learn in the messy details than there ever is in the big headlines. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and keep learning.